Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
As federal agencies shrink and restructure, former civil servants are stepping up to preserve what's being lost. A new oral history project from the Volcker Alliance and the Organization of American Historians captures the voices of displaced federal employees, offering an unfiltered look at public service, policy, and the personal toll of government downsizing. Here with more on the project is the director for the Federal Employees and Contractors Oral History Project, Dr. Jason Chernesky. Dr. Chernesky, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
I'm excited to talk about this project, an oral history project. But first of all, tell us what the project is and why you want to start it now.
So the Federal Employees and Contractors Oral History Project is an effort to capture the oral histories of everyone who worked for the federal government, whether they're a civil servant or a contractor, so that we have a fairly large archive of firsthand accounts of what it is that federal workers do for the federal government, either currently or in the past, recent past, I should say. And really the effort there, one of the big efforts here for us is to make sure that we're capturing all of the institutional knowledge that we can in these oral histories of people who may have been forced out of government because of the firings that have happened and the layoffs in the past 6 months, or from folks who have been recently retired or were, again, maybe perhaps sort of forced to retire because of the changes that have occurred. And really, it's not only to capture the institutional knowledge, but also start to build a database of stories that can help fill the gap, really, between what maybe the public and others interested in these stories think they know what government workers do and what they actually do, so that we can sort of have a really great set of resources for people to use that for content to create other stories about federal workers. But also we want it in their words. We want it in the words of the federal workers. But it's also, in addition to sort of capturing and demonstrating what federal workers have done for the American people, we're including a kind of mini life history as well. And what that means is that one of the methods in oral history is what you might call a life story history. So you sort of start from the very beginning, you tell me about your, where you grew up and everything, and you kind of go through that person's life to where they are at that moment you're recording the oral history. So we're doing a little bit of that too. So it gives listeners some context about who these people are and humanizes them in a way that I think is necessary for these stories. Then sort of like the last bit of the oral history will reflect on these recent changes that have happened over the last 6 months. And because it's a kind of very important historical inflection point, we want to sort of capture that in real time. And some of the things we're going to want to do too is give some of our narrators the ability to come back in a year, 2 years, 3 years to sort of add to their story if they feel that they want to. Because this is the one benefit about doing oral histories now when people are still around and are moving into maybe different careers or different phases of their life. We'll be able to add that to the story, which makes these oral histories very rich, compelling, and useful resources for people.
Well, I know you are an oral historian yourself. Why is that the mode that you want to capture these stories in? Why not just take surveys, or why not have people write essays?
I mean, oral histories, as a historian who practices history in the fairly recent past, I've found those resources extraordinarily valuable for my own research. Why is that? Because the historical record can capture other types of information and other types of data, right? Memos and reports and correspondence. And a correspondence, of course, can capture someone's sort of internal thinking or working through a problem or something like that, right? It personalizes it in a way. When you have the actual person's voice, it really does sort of help make it a little bit more personal. That's number one. Number two, you get a little bit of a look behind the curtain, behind the production of, let's say, a report or an event or something like that. And in aggregate, when you look across a number of those oral histories, you really get a great sense of how people were experiencing a moment, experiencing a phenomenon, a career, whatever the case may be, that isn't captured in other parts of the historical record. So oral histories really enhance and personalize these stories. And I'm trained not only in the history of science, medicine, public health, and environmental history, but really I take this approach, what historians have called for generations now, social history. So it's history from the bottom up, looking at the people who are involved in many of these sort of big events that we talk about or impacted by these big events that we talk about in history, right? So oral histories really are those rare sources that allow you to get at those personal accounts. And what an oral history does, as opposed to a survey, is you have somebody sort of there to ask follow-up questions, to really get you to sort of flesh out as much of the details as possible. And it helps sort of bring more information to the forefront that otherwise might get left out. And of course, oral histories aren't perfect. No one method is. But again, when you put that in a group of other sets of data, you can really enhance a story that you otherwise wouldn't capture if you didn't have that oral history.
I'm speaking with Dr. Jason Chernesky. He's the project director for the Federal Employees and Contractors Oral History Project. So, Jason, in this case, the Organization of American Historians has partnered with the Volcker Alliance to bring this project to life. Why that partnership? How is that helping you reach people or get folks in to tell their story?
The Organization of American Historians, we were able to get support from the Volcker Alliance to help get this project off the ground. And this happened through a set of sort of happenstances, essentially, where in the beginning, when I was trying to get this oral history project off the ground, first the OAH got in contact with me through colleagues of mine who knew the executive director, Beth English, who's sort of overseeing the project from the OAH side. And she asked me if, we wanted to sort of team up and it be an OAH project where I'm directing the day-to-day of putting this oral history collection together. And so, in that time, I was also talking to a number of other folks who are doing similar kind of projects, right, that are trying to capture data that federal employees who have been terminated might have, or how that impacted their lives in certain ways, So through that network, I was linked up with the Volcker Alliance. And they were going to try and do something similar. And when they learned that we were already sort of on the road to doing these oral histories, they were like, hey, how can we help you guys out the best we can? And that has been extraordinarily helpful in getting this project off the ground. And right now we're waiting to see what news we have. We applied to the Mellon Foundation for some funding to really get this project going in earnest for the next 3 years. And we should be getting news out shortly about that. So we're ready to go. We already started collecting oral histories and getting all the infrastructure built. So the next step is really to sort of get out there and talking to as many people as we can to get their stories captured.
Well, speaking of infrastructure, you talked earlier about how scholars use oral histories, but there's also an aspect to this project to make these oral histories available in the general public domain. Why do you think that approach is so important?
I think it's important because I see this as a public resource. We're talking about public servants, and as someone who is a public servant or was a public servant, that's a little bit of a complicated situation right now. But wanting to be a public servant, I always found the value in having these things available to everybody. And the reason is that, these are stories of other Americans that have worked for the public for years, in some cases 20, 30, 40 years, some cases 1 year, depending on where they were in the federal government when these changes occurred in the recent past. So having these things available, I think, are very important to everybody. And it allows people to engage with them on their own terms. They might know somebody in the collection. They want to hear their story, right? They might just be curious about what it is that federal workers have done. And, journalists, other storytellers, other researchers, they'll all have access to this, and it will get filtered through those different mechanisms, whether it's a journalistic account or whether it's through some sort of research initiative. But if people just want to sit and read and listen to somebody's story that they think is interesting, I think that's a really valuable thing as well.
And so if someone wants to tell you their story, how do they get connected to this project?
We have a website that has our pre-interview questionnaire up on the site. So people who are current, former federal workers or contractors can go fill out that form, and then we'll get in touch with them to set up an interview time. And so that's the easiest way to do it. And the website is fecohp.org.
I've been speaking with Dr. Jason Chernesky. He's the project director for the Federal Employees and Contractors Oral History Project. Jason, thank you so much for sharing this story, and I hope others will share their stories with you.
Thanks, Terry. This was great. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the site at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former senior advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites in airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business. And more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge? And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it. Share the credit. Perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.